The restaurant went quiet the moment they walked in. Not the comfortable kind of quiet. The kind where conversations stop mid-sentence and heads turn in unison. Calvin Red felt every pair of eyes on them as he held the door open for his wife, Tessa. She was used to it. The stares, the whispers, the judgment that followed them everywhere in their small Georgia town. But what those people didn't know, what nobody in that room could have possibly imagined, was that the woman they were whispering about was worth more than everyone in that restaurant combined. More than the entire town, actually. What would you do if the people who mocked your love discovered your wife was a secret billionaire heiress? If the same voices that called your marriage charity suddenly started calling it brilliant? This is the story of Calvin and Tessa, a mechanic and a woman with dwarfism who built a love so real that when her fortune was finally revealed, it was a town that learned the lesson, not them. If you've ever been judged for who you love, this story is for you. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to defend your relationship to people who didn't understand it? Because what happened next will restore your faith in what real love actually looks like. Calvin Red worked at Henderson's Auto Repair, a greasy garage on the edge of town where men talked louder than they worked and opinions flowed as freely as the beer after shifts. And their favorite topic? Calvin's wife. Hey, Red, you bring your charity case to the company picnic this year? Someone would shout across the garage, followed by laughter that echoed off the metal walls. Man, what were you thinking? Another would say, shaking his head like Calvin had made the worst decision of his life. They called it charity. They called it desperation. They called it every cruel thing people say when they can't understand why someone would choose love over appearance. But it wasn't just his co-workers. It was everywhere. At the grocery store, other shoppers would stare, some trying to be subtle, others not bothering to hide their judgment. In restaurants, conversations at nearby tables would drop to whispers the moment Calvin and Tessa sat down, only to resume once they thought the couple couldn't hear. Old friends stopped calling. Family members asked if he was sure about this. Neighbors who used to wave suddenly found reasons to avoid eye contact. The cruelty wasn't passive. It was deliberate, pointed, designed to make them feel small. But Calvin never wavered. When people stared, he held Tessa's hand tighter. When co-workers made jokes, he looked them dead in the eye and asked if they had something to say to his face. When strangers whispered, he'd pull her closer and kiss her forehead, a quiet declaration that their opinions meant absolutely nothing. Because Calvin hadn't married Tessa out of charity. He'd married her because she was brilliant, funny kind, and the only person who'd ever made him feel like he was exactly enough just as he was. And Tessa? She'd heard every variation of cruelty long before she met Calvin. But with him, something was different. She didn't just feel loved, she felt safe, protected, seen for who she actually was, not reduced to her appearance or her condition. They had something real. The town just couldn't see it yet. What the people of that small Georgia town didn't know was that Tessa Ward had grown up in a world they couldn't even imagine. Her father, Maurice Ward, was one of the nation's most influential investors, a billionaire who built an empire through private energy companies and shipping operations. His name appeared in financial journals, boardroom conversations, and occasionally on lists of the wealthiest people in America. But Tessa's childhood wasn't the glamorous fantasy people imagine when they think of billionaire families. It was isolation wrapped in privilege. Maurice loved his daughter fiercely, but he was terrified of the world's cruelty. Tessa had been born with dwarfism, and her father knew exactly how ruthless the media could be, how invasive the public eye was, how people would reduce his brilliant daughter to a headline or a spectacle. So he kept her hidden. Private tutors, gated estates, controlled environments where she was protected from the stares and the whispers, but also from life itself. And then came the arrangement. When Tessa turned 23, Maurice presented her with a proposal. Marriage to the son of a business partner. It was strategic, he explained. A merger of families and fortunes. The young man was suitable, and together they could ensure the legacy Maurice had built. But Tessa looked at her father and said one word. No. She didn't want suitable. She didn't want strategy. She wanted a life where she was a person, not a portfolio. The fight that followed was devastating. Maurice couldn't understand why she'd throw away security, legacy, everything he'd worked to build. Tessa couldn't make him understand that she'd rather have nothing than live as an arrangement. So she left. No money, no security, no safety net. She walked away from billions because freedom, real freedom, was worth more than any fortune. For 2 years, Tessa lived on her own, working odd jobs, learning what it meant to be seen as just another person instead of Maurice Ward's daughter. She moved to Georgia, got a job doing bookkeeping for small businesses, and kept her past buried. And then she met Calvin at a community fair, a quiet mechanic with kind eyes who made her laugh within 5 minutes of conversation. He asked her to coffee, then dinner, then if she'd like to see the house he was renovating. He never asked about her family, never questioned her past, never treated her like she needed protecting or fixing. Calvin just saw Tessa, and for the first time in her life, that was enough. They were married within a year, in a small ceremony with a handful of friends, in a life that felt more real than anything wealth had ever provided. For nearly 3 years, Calvin and Tessa built something beautiful in the margins of that small town's judgment. Their routine was simple. Calvin worked at the garage from dawn until late afternoon, coming home covered in grease and exhaustion. Tessa managed their modest finances, kept their small house running, and worked part-time doing bookkeeping for local businesses. Weekends were theirs. They'd spend Saturdays at the hardware store, picking up supplies for whatever project they decided to tackle next, repainting the bedroom, building shelves in the garage, planting flowers in the front yard that Tessa insisted would make the place feel like home. Sundays were quieter. Coffee on the porch, lunch at the diner where the waitress had stopped staring and started actually being friendly. Evenings spent watching old movies on their worn couch, Tessa's head resting on Calvin's shoulder. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. They danced in their kitchen to songs on the radio. They stayed up late talking about dreams that didn't require millions, just time, effort, and each other. They laughed at inside jokes that no one else would understand. The world outside still whispered. Calvin's co-workers still made jokes. Neighbors still gossiped over fences about that odd couple down the street. But inside their small house, Calvin and Tessa had created something the town couldn't touch. Intimacy that didn't need validation. Love that didn't require anyone's approval. Have you ever felt like the world was against your happiness? Like people were waiting for your relationship to fail, just so they could say they were right? Hit that like button if you believe real love doesn't need anyone's permission to exist. Tessa never told Calvin about her past. Not because she was hiding it. Exactly. More because this life felt more honest than anything she left behind. Here, she wasn't Maurice Ward's daughter or an heiress or a headline. She was just Tessa, Calvin's wife, a woman building a life one day at a time. And for 3 years, that was enough. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while Tessa was organizing receipts at their kitchen table. An unfamiliar number. A lawyer's voice, careful and rehearsed. Words that felt like they were coming from underwater. I'm sorry to inform you that your father, Maurice Ward, passed away suddenly yesterday evening. The phone slipped from Tessa's hand. Her father was gone. The man she'd argued with. The man she'd disappointed. The man she'd walked away from but never stopped loving. Gone, without warning, without reconciliation, without the chance to tell him that she understood why he'd been so protective, even if she couldn't live that way. Calvin found her on the kitchen floor, surrounded by scattered papers, tears streaming down her face. He held her, didn't ask questions, just held her while she broke apart. But grief was only the beginning. Within 24 hours, the story broke. Billionaire investor Maurice Ward dies, daughter and sole heir located in rural Georgia. By Wednesday morning, their quiet street looked like a disaster zone. News vans lined both sides. Reporters camped on their lawn. Helicopters circled overhead like vultures. Cameras shoved into their faces the moment they stepped outside. Questions shouted over each other. Miss Ward, did you know about your inheritance? Calvin, how does it feel to be married to a billionaire? Tessa, why did you leave your family? Calvin stood in his own driveway, stunned into silence. This was a woman he'd been married to for 3 years? The woman who'd painted their bedroom walls and laughed at his terrible jokes and fell asleep during movies? That night, When the news vans finally dimmed their lights, Calvin and Tessa sat in their darkened living room. "I should have told you," Tessa whispered. Calvin shook his head. "You told me everything that mattered." He wasn't angry. He understood instantly why she kept it hidden. Because the moment her past was revealed, their life, the one they'd carefully built, was over. Nothing would ever be quiet again. The change happened overnight, and it was disgusting. By Thursday morning, Calvin's co-workers, the same ones who'd mocked him for years, were suddenly his best friends. "Hey, man, I always thought you two were great together," one said, slapping him on the back like they'd been brothers forever. "Calvin, my buddy, you got a minute? I've got this business idea. Just need a small investment to get started." Another pitched, grinning like they hadn't spent 3 years calling his marriage charity. The garage manager, who'd never promoted Calvin despite his skill, suddenly wanted to discuss partnership opportunities. It wasn't just work. It was everywhere. Neighbors who'd avoided eye contact for years suddenly appeared on their doorstep with casseroles and apologies wrapped in transparent self-interest. "We always admired you two. So brave, you know?" The restaurant that served them with barely concealed disgust called personally to offer them a VIP table anytime. Complimentary, of course. Old friends who'd ghosted them reappear with stories about how they'd always believed in Calvin and Tessa's love. Business opportunities flooded their mailbox. Investment pitches, charity requests, people wanting meetings, partnerships, sponsorships. Everyone suddenly had an idea that just needed Tessa's money to succeed. Calvin watched it all with growing revulsion. These were the same faces that sneered at him in the grocery store. The same voices that had whispered cruel things just loud enough for them to hear. The same people who'd made Tessa feel like she didn't belong. And now they were falling over themselves to get close. The transformation wasn't about growth or realization. It was about greed. Pure, simple, shameless greed. This is what happens when people realize you're worth more than they thought. Share this video if you've ever watched fake people switch up the moment your situation changed. Because what Calvin and Tessa did next will restore your faith that not everyone sells their soul for money. Tessa watched it all with calm, sad eyes. She'd seen this performance before. Wealth didn't reveal character, it exposed the lack of it. But she also knew something these people didn't. Money might change how people treat you, but it never changes who you are. The reading of Maurice Ward's will was a national event. Financial networks covered it live. Business journalists analyzed every detail. The public watched with fascination as one of America's largest private fortunes changed hands. Tessa sat in the lawyer's office, Calvin beside her. Cameras excluded by court order, but waiting just outside. The will was straightforward in its essentials. Tessa inherited everything: the energy companies, the shipping operations, the investment portfolios, billions in assets, holdings, and properties. But then came the video. Maurice Ward's face appeared on the screen, recorded just months before his death, looking tired but determined. "Tessa," his voice filled the room, and Tessa's hand found Calvin's, gripping tight. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone, and I never got the chance to tell you in person how proud I am of you." His eyes, so much like hers, were filled with regret. "You were right to leave. I was wrong to try to control your life, to hide you away, to think I could protect you from the world by keeping you from living in it. You taught me that courage isn't about having everything. It's about risking everything for what matters." Morris's voice cracked slightly. "I built this empire thinking it would be my legacy. But you, Tessa, you're my real legacy. Your strength, your compassion, your refusal to let anyone, including me, tell you who you should be." He leaned forward, closer to the camera. "I have one request. Transform Ward Holdings into something bigger than profit. I've already drafted the framework. Use our resources to support families with disabilities. Change the systems that judge you. Help the people who need it most, not as charity, but as justice." Tears streamed down Tessa's face. "You don't owe me this. You don't owe me anything. But if you choose to honor this wish, know that you're finishing what I should have started years ago. I love you, Tessa. I'm sorry it took me losing you to understand what truly matters." The screen went black. The lawyer cleared his throat. uncomfortable with the raw emotion in the room. But Tessa sat still, Calvin's hand in hers, her father's words echoing in her mind. Maurice had finally understood, and in death, he'd given her not just wealth, but purpose. She looked at Calvin, who nodded once, a silent affirmation that whatever she decided, he was with her. Tessa knew exactly what she was going to do. 2 weeks later, Tessa held a press conference in the same small Georgia town that had mocked her marriage. The crowd was massive. National media, local reporters, and hundreds of townspeople who'd suddenly become very interested in the Red family. Calvin stood behind her, steady as always. As Tessa approached the microphone, she could have destroyed them. With her resources, she could have bought every business that had treated them poorly, foreclosed on every mortgage of the neighbors who'd gossiped, made life unbearable for everyone who made life unbearable for her. But revenge had never been Tessa's style. I'm here today to announce the transformation of Ward Holdings into the Ward Foundation for Disability Rights and Support, she began, her voice clear and strong. My father built an empire. I'm going to build something better, a system that ensures families with disabilities have the resources, accessibility, and dignity they deserve. She outlined the plan. $50 million allocated immediately to Georgia communities, funding for accessibility improvements in public spaces, grants for families navigating healthcare systems, job training programs that created real opportunities, not token positions. And then she said something that made the crowd go completely silent. This includes our town. We'll be funding renovations to ensure every public building is accessible. We'll be creating a job training program based out of Henderson's Auto Repair, where my husband works, providing real skills and real employment to people with disabilities who want to work in skilled trades. The same garage where Calvin had been mocked for years would now become a center for opportunity. The same town that had whispered about them would now benefit from the very woman they'd rejected. Tessa didn't mention the cruelty she'd endured. She didn't call out specific people or businesses. She didn't weaponize her wealth for revenge. She simply chose grace. Because that's what real strength looks like. Not domination, transformation. Calvin watched his wife address the crowd with quiet pride. This was who she'd always been. Wealth just gave her a bigger canvas to paint her compassion on. The people who judged them were getting a masterclass in dignity. And not a single one of them had earned it. But Tessa gave it anyway. 6 months later, Calvin and Tessa still lived in the same small house, though they finally finished all the renovations. The town had changed. Not just physically, with ramps and accessible entrances appearing throughout Main Street, but in subtle ways that mattered more. People still stared sometimes, but now the stares came with respectful nods instead of judgment. The garage where Calvin worked had become a genuine training center, employing 12 people with various disabilities who were learning real skills under Calvin's patient instruction. The co-workers who'd mocked him? Most had moved on, uncomfortable with the daily reminder of their own cruelty. But here's the real lesson. Tessa didn't need the money to prove her worth. Calvin had already seen it, and the people who couldn't see it without a bank statement attached, they'd never really mattered. Real wealth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in character, integrity, and the courage to love someone exactly as they are, not for what they have, but for who they are. Tessa walked away from billions to find something real. Calvin gave her exactly that, a love that didn't need validation, approval, or anyone's permission. And when the fortune found them anyway, they used it the only way that mattered, to lift others up instead of tearing anyone down. The town learned something that year. They learned that the people you judge today might be the ones who show you grace tomorrow. They learned that love isn't charity, it's choice. And they learned that real wealth has nothing to do with what you own and everything to do with who you are when nobody's watching. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that character matters more than appearance, more than money, more than what anyone else thinks, then hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done in Calvin's position? Would you have stood by your partner against the whole town's judgment? And share this video with someone who needs to remember that the right person will love you exactly as you are, not in spite of who you are, but because of it. Because at the end of the day, Calvin and Tessa proved something the world keeps forgetting. Love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone who sees your imperfections and chooses you anyway. Thanks for watching Living While Black and Beyond. I'll see you in the next story.